Hey everyone, we are live for Dregs of Wisdom, I believe number 14. We'll have to get that. Actually, Scott, can we just double check that shit? Sorry. What are we on?
And welcome to Dregs of Wisdom with Andrew Tanner.
All right, we are here with Dregs of Wisdom, episode 14. I have a special guest for you today. One of my best friends that I've interviewed so far, I should say. I would call everyone who comes on this podcast as a friend or a colleague, but the fellow we're going to introduce today is someone I've worked with for years. So first, let me introduce Sawyer Hurwitz, better known as Psychotronic Solutions on Instagram. He is an augmented reality collage artist working out of Los Angeles, California. He's also a documentary film director and producer. He's worked with talent such as Beyonce Knowles, David Blaine, Idina Menzel, Casey Neistat, and more. His work is shown in galleries and festivals around the world, from Burning Man to literally castles in Japan. His collages are really intricate meditations on topics related to identity, environmentalism, and socio-political unrest. And they move, they're both physical objects, but also they move when you hold your phone up to them. It's just a really incredible form of art. But I've known Sawyer in many other incarnations, which we'll surely talk about today. So Sawyer, welcome to Dregs of Wisdom. We're so happy to have you. I feel like the first thing that I wanted to ask you about, just to kind of get the ball rolling on stuff, was I wonder what you think the main objective of CIA Operation Midnight Climax was.
What? CIA Operation Midnight Climax? Is this the name of your sex tape? What is this?
So actually, this is a real thing. We always try to stump people in the beginning. I thought that you might know this because of the documentaries that you did on psychedelics, which I want to ask you about. But it was established in order to study the effects of LSD on non-consenting individuals, run by the CIA in safe houses in San Francisco in 1954. Prostitutes on the CIA payroll were instructed to lure in clients where they were given a wide range of substances, including LSD, monitored behind one-way glass, and then they were instructed in certain questions to ask post-coital questioning to investigate whether the victims could be convinced to involuntarily reveal secrets.
Wow. So involuntary. So these people did not know that they were being drugged. I mean, obviously they eventually found out they were being drugged. When it comes to LSD, it's really hard to do proper double blind because it's really clear when you're the one that got the dose. So did these people, when they started tripping, just think that the lovemaking got them to see God and they were willing to divulge whatever they wanted? That's fascinating. Did this fall under MK Ultra?
I think it might have been part of MK Ultra. More importantly, why I asked you that question, maybe you could share a little bit about the documentaries you did around psychedelics. I know as an artist, that's that you have a relationship with that, and I don't know where you want to start that conversation, but I think our listeners would be so curious to learn about that.
Sure, yeah, I didn't realize we'd be talking about that, but I'm happy to divulge. So I've been a psychedelic advocate in one form or another since I was like 13. I think that was around the time I started taking LSD myself, and it was very transformative for me. Huge fan of psychedelics, though I'm not necessarily a proponent of everyone just going out and doing them. I think that there is a fine line between practical application and just general usage. As far as my work with psychedelics more recently, outside of my own personal consumption, I did a couple years ago direct a television series for Roku and Apple TV called Psychedelics Tonight. With the hosts of Psychedelics Today, which is a podcast. And we were interviewing actually largely heads of pharmaceutical companies, people that are on the front lines of research and development for new psychedelics, as well as therapeutic practitioners that are developing curricula for new ways of engaging with and, monitoring people on psychedelics. we only had a 5-episode run. We're waiting to hear back on season 2. And we covered ibogaine. We covered some novel compounds like MEAI, as well as new psilocybin derivatives, as well as new psilocybin manufacturing processes. It's a fascinating world out there. I think a lot of people don't realize that we're actually in sort of a wild west of psychedelic development. And actually, I know that there have been some interesting new patents, and even one of the companies we interviewed just received breakthrough status for one of its less psychoactive LSD derivatives. I think most people don't realize that in the last few years, hundreds of thousands of new psychedelics have been invented. There's the classical ones that everyone knows about, but there is currently an arms race to unlock the human mind through psychedelic research. I believe it was Timothy Leary that said back in the 60s that LSD will do for the field of psychology what the microscope did for the field of biology. Unfortunately, a lot of that research has been stunted for a long time. But now that those floodgates are opening, we're seeing an insane amount of development in recent times in that field, with new compounds being researched and new avenues of the mind being explored. And I'll say one last thing on that, which is, LSD and psilocybin were a huge part of us understanding how serotonin behaves in the brain. With all these new novel compounds that are coming out, especially tryptamines in particular, if we're going to talk about serotonin, they are all slight variations of a serotonin molecule that bond to very specific serotonin receptors. And the slight differences in shape of these molecules and all these different novel compounds, all these different permutations of serotonin, essentially, they are allowing us to understand the specific impacts of, sorry, not the specific impacts, but they're helping us to understand essentially how our brain works, what regions of our brain do what receptors are responsible for causing what effect. And, we're kind of unlocking the mind.
For those that don't know much about neurochemistry, describe serotonin to like a 5th grader. What is serotonin doing in the brain?
Okay, well, I'm not a...
I know you're not a neuroscientist either.
Right, I'm not a neuroscientist.
Oh, you are a doctor of psychotronic solutions.
Yes, I am a doctor, technically. That's a whole nother story. I have a doctorate in absurdity. From
where?
From the Night Meets School of Wizardry. Yeah, it's a bit of a detour, but I can say that a friend of mine, a very interesting fellow who has dedicated his life to sort of pursuing the unknown and avenues that are oft forgotten. He's actually his job is to develop new visual technology for Panavision and Dolby. Really brilliant guy. He used to go to a lot of UFO conventions for shits and gigs, and saw all these people that were calling themselves doctor and wondered how they did it. And turns out there's a loophole in California secondary education licensing law that he was able to exploit to, give a handful of his friends doctorates. So I do have a doctorate that is legally recognized in, I believe, 48 states. It's not fraud for me to say I'm a doctor.
What?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, like, I think, it's what is and isn't fraud is all a matter of, whether or not I'm actually doing anything with that to fraud anyone, which I don't believe I am. For me, it's mostly a joke, but a pretty fun one.
That is, I never knew that was why you put that. I always thought that was kind of just your moniker.
No. It's a thing. Yeah. I can't believe I never told you that. Yeah. So getting back to the neuroscience question, I mean, there are a handful of neurotransmitters that we've identified in the brain. These are essentially molecules that trigger responses by traveling across the synapse between an axon and the dendrite of neurons. And
one brain cell to another.
Exactly. They elicit certain responses. Our understanding of neurotransmitters is that like they have, I guess, specific relationships to behavior. My understanding of serotonin is that it's more connected to sort of mood than, say, for instance, dopamine, which is more concerned with motivation. I think there's also GABA. There's a handful of these things.
Right. GABA. My understanding, and again, neither of us are neuroscientists, but my basic understanding is that GABA is kind of the happiness mood. It's associated with exercise. There's just a lot of associations with more elevated states. Dopamine as a motivator. Like you get dopamine when you're feeling like you want to accomplish something, it pushes you to move forward. And serotonin is I am satisfied with things the way they are neurochemical. I don't know.
I think that's a very reductive summary as far as I'm aware. I think that the impacts of these things are considerably broader than that. But either way, it's essentially one of the languages that the operating system of our mind and our physiology uses to communicate. I think and so serotonin being one of the big ones of that. It's one that a lot of things that we do or consume can have an impact on, and the effects of psychedelics specifically as serotonergic drugs, as drugs that mimic serotonin. The impacts are pretty wide and varied, and there's a handful of classic tryptamines that the effects are pretty well documented in terms of how they affect the receptors and what that does to the brain. These classic serotonergic drugs, tryptamines, would be LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT.
Are the drug companies looking to use those for specific things like depression, PTSD, etc.? Or what the direction that it's going in right now?
Yes. And before I speak on that, I'll say I don't want to spend our whole time talking psychedelics, but
we'll go beyond that.
Yeah, so specifically right now, a lot of psilocybin, MDMA and ketamine. MDMA and ketamine are both not tryptamines. They're actually, I believe, I know MDMA is a phenethylamine. I think ketamine might be as well. I'm not entirely sure on that.
No one knows the chemistry who's listening to this podcast. So
okay, for sure. But yeah, they do have different effects on things like depression, anxiety, acceptance of death, trauma, PTSD. The list goes on. The applications that they are seeing insanely positive results from are pretty varied. And anyone who's done mushrooms, for instance, can attest to the transformative power of these medicines. And I'll speak really briefly on that. But first I'll say that, as far as this research goes, the efficacy, and this is the reason it's been granted breakthrough status by the FDA, of, say, for instance, psilocybin mushrooms, is tremendous compared to the best things on the market. I think that I think it might be Prozac. It's one of the antidepressants, the SSRI inhibitors. I think that the greatest efficacy that we've been able to demonstrate with those is around 30% when it comes to things like PTSD or depression. Whereas with psilocybin, a single dose in a therapeutic setting, we can have, 90% efficacy in treating these symptoms. So we're talking efficacy that's unheard of in medicine, period. So long as you're screening for the right, preconditions to make sure that the correct people are receiving this treatment, it is extraordinary. And a huge part of the way that, at the very least, these classic tryptamines work is they And by the way, I did mention that we're pretty aware of the receptors and sort of like overall how they impact the brain, but there's still a lot to be discovered, especially with the epigenetic effects of these things, what they code or don't code in our genes, what proteins get sequenced or turned on or off when we take them. That is still an emergent field with psychedelic research. But the big thing is they downregulate the default mode network. This is a region of our brain.
You can do that too, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty important thing. The default mode network essentially tells the brain where, like, what pathways it's supposed to do when it gets certain stimuli. So it's like you have an input, and then your default mode network essentially processes how that input, where it goes, right? Which channel of thought, of cognitive action, of neurological, what neurological dominoes fall into place. And the thing is, when you have something like PTSD or, you know, some sort of unhealthy patterning, you know, that can be really hard to break when your mind is essentially just following the pathways it always does. But when you downregulate that section of your brain, that behavior in the brain, I should say, it gives you the opportunity to forge new pathways, to essentially rewire your brain, to give you greater neuroplasticity. And if you use that in a proactive and healthy way, you can essentially rewire your mind out to overcome toxic patterns. And that is immensely valuable. And as a tool for doing that, psychedelics seem to be at this moment one of the greatest things that we have. And I'll say one last thing and quickly summarize this. But
I want to add one little point too, but you go first.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, you asked me about what these companies are interested in terms of psychedelic research and why they're inventing so many new things. The answer is, you know, the psychedelics, at least classical psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin, MDMA, they're not something that you can just take and go out into the world. You know what I mean? It's like take
them and go into a museum of natural history and walk around and look at pictures. Right?
Yeah. I mean, you can, and it's a great time, but it's, in terms of prescribing it as a clinician, that's not the greatest thing to do. And at the moment, the access to these drugs in a legal setting is going to be prohibitively expensive, because you need a contained environment, you need a specialized therapist, you need et cetera, et cetera. And so the holy grail is essentially to find compounds that are psychedelic, that are potentially non-psychoactive, or at the very least have a diminished psychedelic or psychoactive effect, that still yield the positive benefits of additional neuroplasticity, of reduced depression, reduced anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of these companies, that's what the arms race is primarily about. And there's also, again, other effects beyond just the one. I mean, one of the drugs I covered in that series, MEAI, it's being used for addiction and binge disorders, because it triggers the satiation response in the brain. It makes you feel, I've had enough. And so it's not like it gives you a big trip or anything like that, where you like realize, you know, your place in the universe, or it doesn't necessarily make it so that you're more, I mean, it might make you neuroplastic. I'm not sure what they've demonstrated with that, but the benefit of that particular psychedelic is it just makes you feel, I've had enough. And if you're someone that overeats or overdrinks, that's very useful. So, you know, again, we're sort of unlocking new understandings of the mind through the exploration of psychedelic science. And I am both excited and horrified for what that future has in store.
Wow. I love it. I love getting the State of the Union update from you on that every time we connect. I will say the mushroom studies that you reference, I know a little bit about psychedelics, because I once considered that as a career path, going into psychedelic chaplaincy, death doula work, that kind of thing. And the studies that you referenced that having these really high efficacies of dealing with depression, they're currently being done, to my knowledge, in cancer people, end of life patients, because it's psilocybin is a controlled substance. You can't just do studies on anyone, at least not in every state. But where they've been able to do these studies is people that are terminally ill. At least this is one of the studies I know about.
Yeah, it's one. There's many more, but yeah.
But why I want to share this is that these are mostly older individuals, probably mostly baby boomers, and they're having this 90% people that are on death's door and they're depressed because they're dying and they have unresolved issues with their family and et cetera. The huge efficacy they're seeing from that one session is in changing their fear of death, basically eliminating their fear of death and greatly reducing depressive symptoms. And the reason I share this is I think that a lot of older people might think like, those kind of stuff, that's for when you're a hippie. When I was young, I did that, or, like that's for the youngins to try. But I think that that these drugs are going to be tools for anyone at any age, and they might even be better for older people. They might even, and I don't know. Obviously, I'm not a doctor and not a neuroscientist, but I just thought that was interesting. And go ahead, correct me if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, so I don't remember the specific efficacy of the end of life studies. I know that they're also tremendously high. When I referenced the 90%, that was actually for treatment-resistant PTSD patients from combat veterans. So, okay. A lot of people that fought in Iraq and Afghanistan who have been resistant to other forms of PTSD treatment, people that wake up screaming every night, 90% of them had complete remission of PTSD symptoms after a single usage. The remaining 10% had some degree of remission. So again, it's just extraordinary efficacy that is unheard of.
Amazing, because I had heard about the extraordinary efficacy, but with a different study.
It's across the board. I mean, they've also done it with people quitting cigarettes. They've done it with.
Yeah, that was a crazy one too.
Oh yeah, I'm just with all kinds of things.
Yeah. I will try to put some links in the show notes for people to find these studies. So let's switch gears here a little bit. I mean, Sawyer, I've had the pleasure of knowing you for the last 10 years, I think, and just seeing your creativity blossom. This past year, your art gained more critical acclaim went more viral on Instagram. I know you've been featured at different festivals over the years, but now being even in museums and galleries and things. I'd love to hear your perspective. And actually, we're going to try to edit in some of your art. So maybe people are going to see the art on the video version of this right now. But maybe you can share a little bit about your creative process and how you really unlocked creativity as an artist.
My creative process is largely one of sort of exploration and play. Ultimately, typically my pieces involve a lot of thinking and a lot of personal work on a theme. So usually I will have something that I have been thinking about that I want to sort of explore and think out more. And I, as a collage artist, utilize the tool of collage to both access my own subconscious by doing loose image association and, kind of just letting that play out and being like, why did I pick these images? What do these say about my psyche? But also I use, archetypical images from culture and history to sort of, do the same thing with the collective unconscious, right? The Jungian collective unconscious. I like to find images and themes and symbols throughout history, throughout culture that communicate a certain thought or feeling, and in juxtaposing them, elaborate on my own feelings on a topic. So I know that was really heady and weird. Let me refine that a little with an example.
Wait, really quick. Are you like looking on the internet? Are you looking for magazines? Like, where are you finding your
I've been collecting images now for probably like 15 years. But a lot of it is also just, beyond my own collection. Like sometimes I'll take photos of things out in the world. Sometimes I'll like go and make stuff. I will also do a lot of searching. I use a lot of Creative Commons spaces, and I'm also at least decently versed in what is and isn't fair use. I definitely toe that line sometimes. But I think as a collage artist, you kind of have to. but yeah, I mean, ultimately, you know, my pieces are meditations for myself. You know, it's how it kind of like in the same way, you know, those, I forget what they're called, like mind maps or whatever, where you like bubble a word and then you like link out to another thing and you expand that way. It's me doing that. It's visually like, you know, and aesthetically representing my thought process by exploring symbology to dive deeper into a theme or meaning. So for instance, the series that I'm nearly finished with, that I've been working on the last year, is based on the Jungian archetypes of the divine masculine and feminine. I wanted to explore I want to explore what masculinity and femininity in a cultural context are in their healthiest forms, and to also disseminate whether there is anything that is sex specific about those traits. And so in doing so, I chose 4 archetypes, the divine masculine and feminine, and also have a centerpiece of that, which is sort of a queer subversion of the series. And the divine masculine ones are like the king, warrior, magician, lover, and the divine feminine are the maiden, the empress, the sorceress, and the caregiver. And also in each of these, in addition to the archetype, of which I've explored different representations throughout culture, I've also incorporated the bipolar shadows, the overrealization and underrealization of these archetypes. So essentially the toxic versions. And you know,
is the toxic version in the collage itself as well?
yes, yeah. So in the lower third of each of these pieces, there is an exploration of the bipolar shadow. So, you know, for instance, I'm looking across my wall right now where I've got a couple of them. The warrior, the bottom third, I have the sadist and the coward. The overrealization, underrealization. For you know, for like the maiden, it's the seductress and the frigid. You know, these are qualities that are a through line throughout the human experience. And you know, spoiler, the big thing that I've come to, you know, confirm, I guess, through this series is that while our cultural representations have largely skewed on a sex specific axis, these traits are not unique to any one sex. You know, male or female, they are things that exist in both of us. And I know that's not like a big aha, but you know, in furthering my understanding of you know, queer theories, I think that it has more firmly placed me on I like on a ground of, I guess, radical gender thinking.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's a whole nother conversation. You know,
for a while, you do. I know a lot of my audience may not understand this kind of stuff, but I know you. I don't know whether you still identify as queer. I know for like, I don't think, or do you not? Or I don't know.
well, what I love about the word queer is, I mean, it is an identity, yes, but I feel like it's as far as sexual or gender related identities, it's incredibly broad, and in a sense, it's almost a non-identity because of that. You know, identity comes from the Latin root, which means to make the same as. There's a degree to which, when we identify, we are psychologically, you know, choosing a lane to conform to. You know, and I think in a lot of ways, identity, it can become a cage. Me personally, my experiences of selfhood through the lens of gender and my sexuality are things that I have identified as fluid. And you know, I honestly, I'm also very apathetic about all this. You know, whenever
it's not important to you.
It's really not, and for some people it is very important, and I also respect and admire and appreciate that. I just think that for me personally, you know, I don't care. I am subject to feel a certain way about myself and to feel a certain way about others at any given moment, and I like allowing myself the freedom to experience those feelings and express myself in whatever way I see fit, because that is my liberty as an individual. So that's
Nikki Myers. We just interviewed her, and she had this really cool way of introducing herself. She would say, you know, I have an MBA. I am the founder of Yoga for 12-Step Recovery. I'm African American, I grew up in the Midwest, she would list all these things. And then she'd also say, and I was a commercial sex worker, and I was this. Like she lists all her good stuff and all her shadow. And then she would say, and all of those things inform me, and none of those things define me.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I think that that's the big key that I think you also are articulating, which is you've explored your own identities, but also you're not attached to them in the way that maybe others. I think there's a lot of angst that people have around identity right now. Whether holding on to what the gender norms are, or being like, no, we have to have this other world. There's a big, like, these things are so meaningful to people. And I think then.
Well, and that extends beyond just gender. I mean, that also goes into politics and all kinds of things. I think there's a lot of, there's a slippery slope almost with rigid identity. And, and also in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of the reaction to it, in a very repressive and oppressive world, it makes sense that people will want to be transgressive with identity. You see the same thing with people that, that were Catholic and then, realize that shame was a prison and instead, become very outgoing, or, there's a lot of ways in which, like, our responses to these things through transgressivism are also a means of affirming oneself in the wake of repression. And I find that immensely valuable, actually, as an expression, even though, again, it is, a part of this very polarizing reality. And I think politically can be a little terse. I think that transgressive affirmation, though, is pretty important in the disestablishment of repressive norms. Sorry if that's a little too heady.
No, that's okay. I think I followed you. I think you're saying that you support those who seek to express their own individual genders and identities. And
absolutely. I mean, I believe in individual liberties in that regard, is particularly, if you're, so long as what you're doing is with consent to those around you, and you are, I think everyone has bodily and cognitive autonomy, and that is an unalienable right.
Your stuff is so just visually stunning, and for those who are maybe just listening to this, you have to imagine these pieces, like these very intricate collages that are mostly 2 feet by 3 feet, or like 20 by 30 inch in size. I don't know how big. But then when you look at it through a phone or a screen, the collages start to move, and there's a story that's being told through the collage that brings you into them. And it's such a trippy experience to see in person. Because it's augmented reality for those that don't know. And I'm assuming that once people start using the headsets and other things, that your art will also be visible through those mediums as well. Let's return to your creative process, because I just see that I love the story you told about how you were doing other types of art before, and then how collage, you weren't intending for collage to be your career, right?
No.
But maybe you can explain how your creative process blossomed, and then tell us more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I, like many people, grew up with an unhealthy relationship to my own creative process. I've always been a creative. I've always had this drive to make and express. I think that one of the gifts I have in this life is, my communication skills. And, I'm very invested in this reality. I see the discourse of our world, and I want to participate in it, and I want to participate in it through expressive means. And that's always been a through line throughout my life. But unfortunately, the gap between my taste, what I thought was good art, what I thought was meaningful contribution to that discourse, and my skills, my ability to, actually put that to paper, to put that to canvas, was that gap seemed insurmountable to me for a long time. So, growing up, I would try and draw a lot, but then I would look at like the artists I really admired and I'm like, man, my drawings are shit, and just rip it up and all that. And so I was very self-conscious about my creative process for a very long time. And it was paralyzing. In a big way. I mean, I think that my particular relationship to it was very extreme, and I had this great desire to express myself in these different ways. And also this immense perfectionism, procrastination. I had a lot of barriers to my ability to do so. So much so that, like, I think a very extreme example, maybe at the apex of all this, I went to college to study screenwriting. So I've got a degree in visual media production with a focus in screenwriting, and then a minor in writing. I remember there was this one time I was writing a pilot, a TV pilot, and for a class, and I spent 4 days just binging Adderall and smoking like a pack or two of cigarettes a night, just pounding my head against the wall, literally, unable to like write a sentence. It was very extreme. I kind of had an epiphany around 2017 about my relationship to the creative process, where I recognized that, it's very egoistic to think that we create anything, that, us as individuals are in our individual creative impulses are defined by everyone that's ever influenced us before us, and them, everyone that's influenced them, and all the way back to the creative founding of the human experience. We are just, echoes on the pools, ripples on the pools, trying to express some variation of the same thing, which is, love, which is connection, which is, I think it's something that's very foundational to the human experience. And when I learned to sort of separate my ego from my creative process, I was able to sort of embody it more wholly and just appreciate the act. And for me, collage specifically as a medium, I devoted a lot of time to and was able to bridge that gap between taste and skill purely because during that period where I was so self-conscious about my creative process, I didn't apply that same thinking to collage because I thought no one gave a shit about collage. I did not take it seriously as an art form. I thought it was just some silly craft bullshit I did that I didn't really have to think about in such a heady way. And because I sort of ignored its potential, it gave me the opportunity to actually develop my talent with it to a point that it became something that was commercially viable.
Mm. Has that given you any kind of spiritual, like, lesson out of that? I mean, what have you learned from that?
I mean, so much. I almost feel like that journey has sort of been one of the defining experiences of my life. I mean, it's still an ongoing process always. Refining myself as a creative. I'm certainly not at the end point, and I don't know if I ever will be. And I think that that's awesome.
Going through the experience of the thing that you think is so important, your brain just won't let you do it. And then this thing that you're just doing on the side to feel better about yourself, just as a way of expressing, that you then end up spending more time doing, it suddenly becomes the thing that creates all these opportunities for you as a creative, as to live your Dharma, to live your purpose. What lesson do you think, has that shown up anywhere else in your life, or have you reflected on that in any way?
Yeah, I think it's a constant lesson. I think there's so much I learned in terms of grace, in terms of acceptance. I mean, the rigidity with which I approached my creative process prior to, developing this new skill of allowing what was unhealthy. And I think that when it comes to perfectionism, to procrastination, to work-related anxieties of any kind, it's all kind of interrelated, it's all about how we perceive our end goal and how we perceive ourselves.
Have you been able to take that lesson and either help other artists with their work, or, you know, for the creative person listening to this podcast, like, what advice would you give them if, let's say, they have a project that they're not able to get off the ground? If they, you know, where do you guide them first?
So you know, this is something that I have been in the process of turning into a career that works in tandem with my creative career, is actually creative counseling. I have a website where I allow people to book time with me to sort of refine and work on their creative process and help them get to like their end goals. It's creativealchemycoaching.com. And so this is something that I have been doing. And if you go on there, actually, when I have a free PDF that summarizes what I think are sort of the essential ethos around having a healthy relationship to your creative process. And so I would say like the best way to sort of refine that, because honestly, if I answer that question in full, that would be all of our time. It would be more than all of our time.
Is that the workshop that you're going to give at the Berkshire Yoga Festival?
Yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, I do have a form of that is a 2-hour workshop. So you know, again, as far as like general advice to meet people where they're at, there's so much to it. I mean, you know, I think that what I mentioned about ego before is certainly like one of the big pieces of advice I give to creatives, is to sort of separate self from the process. And that's a whole conversation too. You know, I also I have like a list of you know, of ways to engage with your art, to be thinking about practice from a more deliberate place versus like repetition. I talk to people about, you know, how they consider like evolving their creative process. I mean, there's so much. There's so much attitude, creative hygiene. I've got a lot of commentary on that. It's just a lot to summarize.
What do you think is the first thing, if you had to pick just one?
Just one.
And it's okay. They may do more than just one, but you only can pick one right now to share. What would it be, and what would the benefit of it be for anyone who's wanting to engage their creativity more in life?
Yeah. Let's see. I already communicated to a degree about the ego thing. So I'll say, you know, one piece of advice that I received that really resonated with me, I got from one of my art teachers in this life, this man named Dave Zabowski. Used to be an art director for Disney, really brilliant artist. Offhandedly, one time he just said to me, technique is a lovemaking process. And he doesn't even remember saying it. It was just some shit that he threw out of the wind. Yeah. Like, I was like, what? Technique is a lovemaking? What are you? Wow. Okay. And it sounds simple and it sounds kind of stupid, but you know, like I said before, the creative act and like surrendering ego, right, is sort of a matter of allowing the creative forces of the universe to channel through you, right? It is acknowledging that you as an individual are a part of the whole. It's very yogic in the sense that, you know, in the Vedas, we have this concept of Indra's web, right? We are nothing and everything at the same time, just a recursive refraction of everything else in existence. Our individual consciousness is just a point of reference, recycling matter within the turbulent soup of a networked existence. And, you know, surrendering to that is important. But, you know, the process of surrendering to that, right, is presence. And this is true for everything, even beyond just creative acts, right? Like, I think the art of navigating this existence with grace is a matter of presence. And
are you saying that lovemaking is about presence?
Absolutely. Let me tell you, if you've ever, what's the difference between a really great lovemaking experience and a really terrible one? Is it's that connection. When you're making art, the more that you can engage with your medium as though you would a lover, with grace and the wholeness of your attention, the more the greater your art will be. And at the end of the day, the quality of your artwork, if you're giving it the wholeness of your attention, it's however good it is, it will be the best that you're able to do. That's how you do your best work, is by being present with it. And, you know, engaging your medium in that way and doing your best if you were doing that, no matter how it turns out, you did your best. That's it. That's all you can ever ask of yourself. Anything more than that is an act of futility and self-hatred. And so, I'd say surrender to your influence and your impulses and your process, and just be present with it. Enjoy it. It is a one of the most fulfilling emotional and intellectual releases that exists in this universe is the act of creation. It is a means by which we embody God, the creator, not to get too heady, religious, philosophical, but like it is something that is deeply important and spiritual to each of us, is the act of creation. And the way that we engage with it, with the fullness of our being, is by making love. it's by engaging with presence. That is the art of making love. And anything and any self-consciousness beyond that is, again, just an act of futility. That's how you make your best work. And the more you do that, the better you get, the better you're able to engage with it. And it's a practice like everything else, like yoga. Anyone that's doing a lot of yoga can attest, right? Is that the first time you get on that mat, half the time you're thinking like, oh God, is someone looking at my butt? And by the end of it, a few years or decades into your practice, you're really hearing yourself, you're really feeling yourself, you're really learning to ground into this moment. And it just gets sweeter and more beautiful. And art is like that as well.
Yeah, I think taking art as almost like a hobby and an enjoyment is going to be how you're going to get the best out of your art. For anyone that's kind of on that path.
I don't think I just want to make a comment on that. Because you said as a hobby.
Sorry. I mean, I'm not talking about someone who wants to be a professional artist, but go ahead.
But even then, I mean, like, I think that capitalism corrupts everything. It's it gets what's up?
Tell us why.
Well, just in the sense that, like, the idea that art has to either be a hobby or a profession or this and that, and the way that we conceptualize our relationship to our creative process is through a lens of capitalism. Even when we say like, oh, just surrender and appreciate it, oftentimes the impulse is to say like as a hobby, even if like then it can become professional or whatever, right? Is that there's always this impulse to divorce it from the economics of our reality, existing in a capitalist world. I think that art comes at its best when it is divorced from capitalism, in the sense that the source of creativity is not financial drive necessarily. It can be a driver, but it's not like, how we channel source consciousness. I'm just commenting on the mention of the hobby or profession thing, is like, there's always this drive to like view it through that lens. And I think that lens is
more valuable because you're selling it, like a society. Because you're famous or whatever.
I think the act of creation exists on a different plane. And, when we bring it down to a practical reality, that's how things shape out. And that's, an important thing to consider is the economics of it. But I think that when engaged in the act, I think that's a distraction.
Yeah. So I agree with that what you're saying is the more you can make your art divorced from any outcome-based thinking, from any, who it's going to be shown to, where it's going to be, whether you're going to sell it or not. Like, if the more you can get rid of outcome, to let go of the fruits of your actions, as we say from the Bhagavad Gita, then the more you'll be able to channel the creative forces and allow the art to move through you.
I love that you brought up the Gita, because, and specifically like divorcing yourself from any outcome. I mean, that's one of the core tenets of Dharma, right? Is detachment from outcome. You gotta, the more you think about how it has to be, how your things are going to be received, that's taking you out of the present moment. if you think about how it's going to be received financially, or how it's going to be received critically, or whether it'll make people say, oh, he's so brilliant, he's so, like, is not it, that's just that's a different headspace, and it's not presence, and it's not you engaging with your medium with the wholeness of your being. It's a distraction.
I feel that stories are important. This podcast is called Dregs of Wisdom, and it's about like pulling the little dregs of truth out of the stories of life. And I know you're someone who's had just a really unique life. And I wonder if there's a story that you could share, either from your childhood in kind of when you were traveling in your forays, or perhaps the festival life that you've been involved with. Is there a story that sticks out in your mind where you had a moment of realization about life, and just sharing that story with us would be really cool?
A lot of my life was surrounded around a very rigid pursuit. I was going to be like a math person. I was doing national competitions for advanced combinatorics when I was in middle school. And, I, was on a very accelerated math related learning path. I was going to be a computer scientist. I had a lot of rigor around who I was supposed to become. You mentioned my adventures and this and that. I found psychedelics at a moment in my life when just started reading like Nietzsche and On the Road and the Beats, Kurt Vonnegut when I was around like 14, and like it basically kind of as a result of that, I actually got expelled from the high school I was in. I was a top student, but my school had a zero tolerance drug policy, and they found a trumpet mouthpiece that we had used for a water bottle bong that had a little bit of a weed smell to it. And that was enough for me to leave traditional education for a moment. And that was around the time where I was starting to really get into psychedelics and and explore who I was in a more meaningful way. And I took a lot of that time in the year following to just do psychedelics, once to twice a week, and just travel. And
basically at the age of 14 or 15, you stopped going to school, you traveled for a year and did psychedelics every week or so?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a little bit more complex than that. There were like periods of travel, periods of staying at home, this and that. I did online schooling, so I wasn't completely divorced from education, but I certainly left a traditional educational route and started exploring my own interests more. And I guess like in terms of a dreg of wisdom, right? You're trying to dredge it out. I think that this comes down to what I was saying a little bit about like identity before, is that, when we're too rigid in our definitions of self, I am a computer scientist, I am a math, whatever. It kind of like shuts us off to the possibility of what we can become. And I think that experience of, I often tell people being expelled was one of the best things that ever happened to me. Because it gave me an opportunity to sort of evaluate my own life and my own interests. And honestly, it was no longer about what I'm being told is who I'm supposed to become. It's not about what I'm being rewarded for or told is good or whatever. It's like, what do I want? Who am I? And, what I really came down to with that is I hate math.
You're good at it.
It's so funny. Yeah, I was very good at it. It didn't do anything for me spiritually. I felt that what I really cared about was a little bit more abstract, and I felt that my role in this life was more oriented around compassion versus logic. Although of course it is a medium, or it is a meeting point for the two of them. But, I decided that who I wanted to be is, I wanted to be a creative, and I wanted to, utilize, mediums of communication to influence people toward a more healthy relationship to self and the environment. And that was sort of that's been the driving force and through line for my career, and sort of all of my creative pursuits. Is ultimately I really want to have a positive impact on a world that I feel like has really, lost its way. And I guess one additional drag of wisdom, Andrew, and I'm sorry if this is getting too, I guess, personal or myopic. I hope that this is still valuable to your listeners. But you know that I recently took an extended sabbatical to live in Costa Rica for a while, where I was really thinking heavily about whether or not that mindset of like, oh, I'm here to like help was actually valuable or detrimental to my own experience. I realize that it's a fine line that you have to reconcile both a part of you that is just a being existing in this universe, that is both good and bad and will always be good and bad. And you must surrender to the Tao, and the person that, in I guess a more Abrahamic, background, wants to see the world as a place where there is good and evil, and you can be a shaping force and pushing things towards a greater good. I think that in a sense they are conflicting ideologies, and it's a lot to balance the both. And ultimately it comes down to sort of accepting what's out of your control, and just doing your best like everything else.
I think that's a great place to stop. I think, that the fact that sometimes being forced out of what everyone expects you to do can give you the space to find out what you really want to do. I think that's a powerful truth. And then it sounds like you've recently had this awareness that you do still want to be part of moving toward the good, while also accepting that you're going to just do whatever the role you can do in this crazy universe.
Yeah, no guilt trip. I will say one little caveat on that first thing is, you're going to fuck up. Like, I think that, a huge part of the process of self-exploration is making mistakes. You're going to think that there's something you're supposed to do or should be doing or this and that isn't it. Or maybe it is it, but like it's never a straight path, or I should say rarely ever a straight path. And the process of self-exploration is, there has to be allowance, and you have to avoid rigidity, because when you say things like, I am an artist, I am a this and that, I'm going to do this, it's really easy to fall into the pitfall of, identity. And, the problem with identity, again, is it's a matter of conforming, and what we are as individuals are so much more complex than any one word can contain.
Truly. All right, Sawyer, thank you so much. Look forward to sharing your work, seeing you this summer, and just continuing to pull out the dregs of wisdom together.